March 10, 1945. New York Harbor. 6:14 in the morning. An American soldier raises electric clippers to the head of a German woman prisoner of war and says, "I'm sorry." She expected a rifle butt. She got an apology. 48 German women stepped off that troop ship that morning, heads crawling with lice, uniforms rotting after 18 months without a real wash. They had been warned. Nazi radio told them exactly what Americans did to capture Germans. Beatings. Humiliation. Worse. These women braced for all of it. Instead, they smelled coffee. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe real history is always stranger and more powerful than fiction. What happened to these 48 women inside an American POW camp in Virginia would not just save their bodies. It would destroy everything their government had spent 12 years building inside their minds. And it would do it not with bombs or propaganda, but with soap-hot food and a private from Iowa who taught them English words on scraps of paper. By the time these women went home, they would carry something their Reich never wanted them to have. The truth. Ned, stay with me, because this story starts with lice and ends with a lesson about power that the world is still learning. By early 1945, the war in Europe had a smell. It was the smell of bodies and snow, of phosphorus burning through rooftops, of diesel and old blood, and the particular rot that fills a city when its sewers are destroyed. Germany had been at total war for more than 5 years. Not the clean, triumphant war the propaganda posters promised in 1939, the War of Eagles and victory marches and Aryan destiny. The real war, the one that burned Hamburg in a single week in July 1943 and killed more than 40,000 civilians in the firestorm. The one that left Dresden a skeleton of Gothic arches poking up through ash. The one that had, by the winter of 1944 to 1945, pushed German civilians onto ration cards that delivered fewer than 1,000 calories per day in the hardest-hit areas, roughly the same as slow starvation. German women in uniform had followed the war in their own way. Nurses, radio operators, typists, signals clerks, auxiliary workers attached to Luftwaffe units, to communications networks, to field hospitals that ran out of morphine in 1943 and never got more. They were not soldiers in the legal sense. They were not meant to be captured. But war does not follow the blueprints drawn up in peacetime, and by late 1943 and through 1944, as Allied forces pushed through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and then across France after D-Day in June 1944, hundreds of German auxiliary women found themselves swept up in the collapse. They moved through transit camps that were not built for them. French facilities improvised detention centers near the Channel staging posts where the food was thin soup ladled from a single pot, and the sleeping arrangements were cold concrete floors shared with hundreds of others. Lice found them quickly. In conditions of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and no access to hot water or regular medical care, lice do not stay a minor inconvenience. They spread. They breed in clothing, seams, and hair. They carry typhus. In World War I, typhus killed more soldiers on the Eastern Front than combat did. By late 1944, the women in those transit camps were scratching until their scalps bled, losing sleep, developing skin infections. The lice became a constant, maddening companion, a small living army that no one could fight with the tools available. And no one in those transit camps apologized. The 48 women who boarded that gray troop ship in early 1945 had survived all of it. They were thin. They were exhausted. Their uniforms, which had once fit properly, now hung loose on frames that had lost significant weight. One of them was 24-year-old Anna Bauer from Hamburg. She had trained as a nurse before the war, been assigned to a Luftwaffe communications unit, and had spent the final chaotic months of 1944 moving westward ahead of advancing Allied forces. Watching the organized military structure she had served inside simply dissolve around her like sugar in rain. When capture came, it came not with drama, but with exhaustion. A checkpoint. An American sergeant who looked barely old enough to shave. A gesture toward a holding area, and then the long, slow machinery of prisoner processing. Anna gripped the ship's rail as New York appeared. She had seen photographs of it before the war. Glass towers, wide streets, a skyline that looked like ambition turned to steel and concrete. Nazi radio had updated that image during the war years. It told her the city was violent, corrupt, a rotten place run by the enemies of Germany, a place where captured Germans would face hatred and cruelty as a matter of course. She believed some of it. She had been raised to believe it, and after 18 months of cold concrete and thin soup and lice, she was too tired not to be afraid. What she saw instead was tugboats. Dock workers shouting to each other about mundane things. Cranes moving on their rails. The sharp smell of disinfectant rising from a canteen shed on the pier, mixed with something she had not smelled in a very long time. Coffee. The paradox arrived before she had even set foot on American soil. The paradox did not have a name yet. It was just a smell and a confusion, and the absence of the rifle butts she had expected. An American MP walked beside the women as they came down the gangplank. His rifle was slung casually over his shoulder barrel, down the body language of a man who does not expect trouble. In the transit camps, and the long months before capture, guards had always held weapons at the ready. Always. It was a language of threat so constant that its absence felt like a trick. Inside the long shed at the end of the pier, the steam was visible before she entered. Tables with clipboards, medical orderlies in clean uniforms, piles of folded cloth, metal basins, and in the corner, an army barber's chair with an electrical cable running from it to a small stand that held a pair of electric clippers already humming softly. The interpreter was a young German-American private from Ohio, whose German was clear but accented like someone who had learned it at a grandmother's kitchen table. He explained what was going to happen. The lice had to be removed. Their hair would be cut short. Some heads would be shaved entirely. He said it plainly without cruelty, but without softening it either. A sound moved through the line of 48 women like a wave. Not a scream, not protest. Something lower and more private, a collective flinch. In Germany, long hair was not decoration, it was respectability. In Nazi imagery, the ideal German woman had thick braids. It was a symbol tied up with femininity, with worthiness, with the identity that the state had been selling them since childhood. Shaved heads in Germany meant criminals, traitors, the disgraced. The thought of sitting in that chair before these foreign men, and losing their hair, felt like the humiliation they had been promised. The proof that the Americans were exactly what they had been told. One woman, Liesel, a former typist from Cologne, gripped her braid with both hands and refused. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You will not shame me," she said. The American nurse in charge, Lieutenant Margaret Hill, did not raise her voice. She stepped forward, her white coat brushing the concrete floor, and spoke slowly so the interpreter could keep pace. "If the lice stay," she said, "they will keep making you sick. You have been sick long enough. I am sorry, but this is to help you." The word landed strangely. Sorry. The enemy was sorry. Anna wrote about it years later. In that moment, I did not know what to hate. The clippers or the kindness. The first woman sat in the chair. The clippers buzzed. A clump of dark hair fell to the concrete, and lice spilled out of it, pale and searching. A medical orderly stepped forward immediately with powder and a broom. No one laughed. No one made a sound beyond what the work required. When Anna's turn came, she kept her eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden wall and felt gentle fingers work the pins from her hair. The clippers passed over her skull again and again. Cold air touched skin that had not seen light in years. She waited for the insults. They did not come. When the nurse nicked her scalp by accident, she stopped, pressed antiseptic to the tiny cut, and said in careful, slow German, "I am sorry." Anna wrote. The strangest thing was not the loss of my hair. It was that the hands that took it were careful. Each woman who stepped down from the chair was handed a plain cotton headscarf and pointed toward the steam at the far end of the shed where the showers waited. The lice were gone. The shame they had braced for had not arrived. In its place was something harder to process, a system efficient enough to strip them down to their skulls and still somehow see them as human beings. Outside harbor, cranes kept moving. Trains waited to carry them south to Virginia. The camp was a working American military facility, not a showpiece. Guard towers stood at the corners. Barbed wire ran along the perimeter fence and caught the morning light in the way barbed wire always does, functional cold, indifferent. But inside the fence, the buildings were painted white. Small flower beds grew beside the footpaths. These were not there for the prisoners. They were there because American military camps in 1945 simply operated that way. Hundreds of them, spread across more than 40 states, housing at their peak nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war. Men mostly. But the system that processed them did not distinguish by gender when it came to basics. By 1945, the United States Army was feeding housing and providing medical care to more prisoners of war than any nation in history. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required adequate food shelter, medical attention, and pay for work performed. America had signed it. And in a country that had not been bombed, had not been blockaded, had not seen its factories dismantled or its farms burned, compliance with the Geneva Convention was not a sacrifice. It was simply a matter of logistics. The system worked because America had the resources to make it work. Anna did not know any of this when she stepped under the showerhead in the Virginia camp's reception building. She knew only that the metal groaned, and then hot water, actual hot water, came down on her in a rush that hit her shoulders like a warm hand and did not stop. The soap was smooth and white and smelled faintly of lemons and hospital. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its solid weight, and then she began to scrub. The water ran gray off her body, then brown, then finally clear. Around her, other women did the same. Some cried. Others made small sounds that were almost laughter, the involuntary noise of a body remembering what it was before the war. When she dressed in the clean clothes from the U.S. Army store's dress, too large coat, too wide, wool socks that stayed up only if she rolled them, and sat in the medical room, while a doctor pressed a stethoscope to her chest and wrote numbers on a clipboard, Anna Bauer weighed 43 kilograms. Before the war, she had weighed 60. The food came next. The mess hall was a long building with large windows. The smell reached her before the door did meat frying bread, baking the dense warmth of boiled vegetables, and underneath it all, coffee, real coffee, not the substitute grain paste that had passed for it in Germany since 1942. The serving line stretched the length of one wall. Behind it, army cooks in white aprons stood with ladles and serving spoons above trays that steamed in the cool air. Mashed potatoes, a roasted meat with gravy, green beans, bread, and at the end, something so unexpected that several women simply stopped walking and stared. Canned peaches, yellow and trembling in syrup, in a metal tray under the lights. "Take," the cook said, gesturing. The interpreter added in German, "They say you can eat as much as you like, but slowly. Your stomachs are not used to it." No one moved at first. The scale of it was incomprehensible. In their last camp in France, the daily ration had been thin soup and one piece of stale bread. In Germany itself, civilian rations in the hardest months of late 1944 had fallen to levels that medical authorities described as dangerous. And here in the enemy's country, food sat in wide metal trays, with enough left over that some of it would be thrown away. Anna put her plate on the counter. The cook scooped it without ceremony. Potatoes, meat, beans. At the end, the woman with gray hair and a kind face added 2 peach halves in syrup, and they trembled on the plate as Anna carried it to a table. She sat. She looked at the food for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then a woman across from her took the first bite, chewed slowly, with her eyes closed, and began to cry. "It tastes of nothing at first," she whispered. "No, it tastes of everything." Anna raised her fork. The meat was soft and salty. The potatoes were rich. The peach, when she reached it, was sweet and cold, and it sent a memory through her so specific, it was almost physical, a market in Hamburg before the war, A summer afternoon, her mother laughing at something Anna had said. That night, lying on a real mattress under 2 wool blankets in a clean bunk, her stomach full for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, Anna Bauer felt something that surprised her completely. Guilt. She lay in the dark and thought of Hamburg, of the firebombs in 1943, of her mother's last letter written in the careful handwriting of someone trying not to alarm, saying, "We stretch everything. We are thin. But our spirit is strong." That letter was months old now. Since then, there had been more raids. Her mother was alive. She believed that had to believe it, but alive on what, 800 calories a day, less in a city that might be rubble. She was eating more than 2,500 calories a day, nearly as much as an American soldier in the field, and somewhere across the Atlantic, her family hid in cellars. She wrote in the small notebook a camp worker had given her, writing carefully in the dark. "Why am I safe and warm while my family hides? The enemy feeds me better than my own state ever did. I do not know what to do with this fact." The camp gave her time to sit with that question. Work details, roll calls at dawn, the laundry room with its steaming tubs, and the private from Iowa named Jack Miller, who had sandy hair and a habit of humming to himself, and who spent every spare minute trying to teach her English. Cart, soap, bucket, sun, rain. He wrote the words on scraps of paper with small pictures underneath. He treated the language like a gift, not a transaction. Anna waited every day for the other face. The cruel face she had been told was the real one. It never arrived. She was beginning to understand that reality and what she had been taught about reality were two very different countries. But in April 1945, the Americans were going to show her something on a projector screen in the recreation hut that would make the paradox not just confusing, but devastating. Something that would force her to ask not just who her enemy was, but who exactly her own side had been. In part 2, we go inside that projection room. The curtains close, the machine hums, and 48 German women are about to see for the first time what was done in their name. What they see will break some of them, and quietly, permanently rebuild others. She arrived in Virginia with lice gone, and beliefs still intact. She left with neither. Last time, 48 German women stepped off a troop ship in New York Harbor expecting rifle butts and got soap instead. Anna Bauer, 24 years old, a nurse from Hamburg, sat in an enemy camp on a full stomach with clean hair growing back on her shaved skull and a notebook full of questions she did not yet know how to answer. Private Jack Miller from Iowa was teaching her English on scraps of paper. The mess hall was serving canned peaches, and somewhere beyond the fence, the Third Reich was dying. But the Americans were not finished with these women yet, because in April 1945, they wheeled a projector into the recreation hut and drew the curtains. And what appeared on that screen would do what 18 months of lice starvation and cold concrete could not. It would make 48 German women question everything they thought they knew about the country that had raised them. Over 6 million. That number was on a printed sheet handed to every woman in that room before the lights went down. They did not know yet what it meant. The projector hummed. The image jumped. And the war ended for Anna Bauer in a way no one had planned. The recreation hut held maybe 60 people when it was crowded. That April evening it held 48 German women, several American guards, the interpreter from Ohio, and a Red Cross representative who had driven in from Richmond and sat near the back with his hands folded. The curtains were heavy canvas. They blocked the last of the evening light completely. The room smelled of dust and the faint oil of the machine, and the particular warm closeness of too many bodies in one space. The film opened with a gate, iron, words above it that some of the women recognized and some did not. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Then barbed wire. Then barracks, long low, worse than anything in Virginia. Then the camera moved closer, and the women in the room began to understand what they were looking at. Them people in striped uniforms. Or things that had been people. The distinction was hard to hold. Skeletons wearing fabric. Faces that were mostly eye socket and cheekbone. They moved slowly, some not at all. The camera did not flinch. It was American Army Signal Corps footage shot in the days immediately following liberation, before the bodies could be moved or the evidence could be explained away. It was not edited for comfort. It was not edited at all. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. The interpreter said the names quietly one at a time as each camp appeared on screen. Then a bulldozer. The sound of its engine was audible even through the cheap speakers mounted beside the projector. It was pushing bodies, not wreckage, not debris. Bodies. Thin, naked, stacked in the way you stack firewood when you have run out of space and run out of time, and stopped thinking of what you are stacking as something that was ever alive. One woman cried out and covered her face. Another made a sound that was not language. Several stared with completely dry eyes, the stillness of shock that sits too deep for tears to reach. A few hissed lies. Hollywood tricks, made to shame us. The words came out fast defensive, the verbal equivalent of a hand thrown up in front of the face. Anna could not look away. It was the shaved heads that did it. She had expected the starved bodies to be the worst of it, or the bulldozer, or the mountains of shoes, an entire frame filled with shoes, hundreds of them, thousands with the small ones visible. If you look the children's ones, that image lasted only 4 seconds on screen and left a mark that did not fade for the rest of her life. But it was the shaved heads that broke something open inside her. 3 weeks earlier, she had sat in a barber's chair in a shed in New York Harbor. She had felt clippers on her skull and heard a nurse say, "I am sorry," when the blade nicked her. She had been given a cotton scarf and pointed toward hot water and white soap. The Americans had shaved her head to save her from the lice living in her hair. And on the screen in front of her, she was watching heads shaved for a completely different reason. A reason that had nothing to do with lice, and everything to do with the systematic removal of the idea that the person sitting in the chair was a person at all. Same sound, same cold air on the scalp afterward. Different world, different meaning. A distance between the two acts so enormous that it could not be measured in any unit she had available to her. "They apologized when they cut us," she wrote that night. In those places, no one apologized. They took everything. The hair was only the beginning of what they took. After the film, the lights came up slowly. The Red Cross representative stood and held up a small blue booklet. The Geneva Convention of 1929. He said, "Your government signed this document. Our government signed this document. It requires adequate food, shelter, medical care, and fair treatment for all prisoners of war. That is why you have received what you have received here. It is not generosity. It is law. We follow the law because we signed it." Right. He paused. Then, the camps on that screen were not prisoner of war camps. They were not regulated by the Geneva Convention. They were built and operated outside any law that any signatory nation had agreed to. They were built and operated by your government. These are not American claims. These are German documents, German train schedules, German administrative records found in German offices by American and British soldiers. The numbers are not estimates. They are in the paperwork. Over 6 million Jews. More than 40,000 sites of detention, forced labor and killing across German-controlled Europe. The printed sheet was passed around. Some women read it, some could not. In the barracks that night, the arguments went in every direction. Some women refused entirely. They fabricated it. All of it. Hollywood has the technology, the money, the motive. Liesel from Cologne, who had gripped her braid at the pier and said, "You will not shame me," was in this group. Her voice was firm. Her hands were not quite steady. We are supposed to turn against our own people. That is the purpose of this. A woman from Frankfurt sat on her bunk and said very quietly, "Without looking up, I saw Jews taken from our street in 1941. We were told they were going to work in the East." She stopped. Started again. But why would workers be starved like that? Another from a town near Poznan said her brother had written from Poland in 1942. Hinted at shootings, mass shootings. She had told herself he was exaggerating because he had always been dramatic about things, and because the alternative was a thing she could not hold in her mind and continue functioning. Now I think she said he was not exaggerating. Anna said nothing for a long time. She lay on her bunk and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word sorry, the nurse at the pier, the antiseptic on the tiny cut. I am sorry. She thought about Jack Miller writing English words on scraps of paper and treating the language like a gift. She thought about the doctor in the reception building who had pressed the stethoscope to her chest and written her weight in a column with the same careful attention he would have given to anyone, enemy or not. She thought about the peaches in syrup and the clean sheets and the 2 wool blankets that had been on her bunk without being asked for. And she thought about the bulldozer. She wrote, "Our side said it fought for honor and order. It built places where there was no order and no honor. Only the machinery of death run like an industry. Their side, the side we were taught, was barbaric and corrupt, bound itself with rules, and followed them even when the enemy was us. Where then is the honor? Where has it been this entire time?" She did not show the notebook to anyone that night. The questions inside it were too large and too dangerous to say out loud in a room full of women who were each processing the same thing at different speeds and arriving at different places. So, the next morning roll call at dawn. The bell. The line. An American guard with sunburned ears and a rifle slung loose on his shoulder counted them and nodded and went about his day. The mess hall served eggs. Eggs. Scrambled eggs with bread and coffee, and Anna sat at her usual table and ate and thought somewhere in Germany. Right now my mother is eating whatever the ration card allows, which is not this, which is not anything like this. The guilt had a new layer now. It was no longer just the guilt of eating well while her family starved. It was the guilt of having believed for years in a state that had been doing that, had been running what she saw on that screen. She had not known. She could say that honestly. She had not known the scale, had not known the specificity, had not known the paperwork and the train schedules and the administrative precision of it. But she had heard things as everyone had heard things, and she had chosen not to ask the questions that the things she had heard should have prompted. Not asking a question she was beginning to understand was itself a kind of answer. The camp continued its routines. The laundry, the kitchen, the canning facility outside the wire where American workers passed gloves across a conveyor belt without malice. Jack Miller hummed and taught her the word for window and the word for peace. The Red Cross truck came and brought knitting needles and German novels and a fresh football. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The loudspeaker crackled. The interpreter's voice. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is finished. The mess hall went completely silent. A spoon clinked against a tin cup and the sound was enormous. Anna felt a heavy tiredness and a single question. The question was not what came next for Germany. The question was what came next for her, for what she believed, for the framework she had used to understand the world for the first 24 years of her life. That framework had been built by a state that she now knew had shaved heads to erase identity, while another state shaved heads to remove lice. The states were not equivalent. The gap between them was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of kind, of what a government decided to see when it looked at a human being. She was going home soon. She knew that. The list would come. Her name would appear. A truck, a ship. The Atlantic, the German coast. Hamburg. She did not know yet that what she was returning to was barely recognizable. She did not know about the cold winter of 1946 to 1947, or the Marshall Plan, or the economic miracle that would rebuild the ruins into something her grandchildren would inhabit without knowing what it had replaced. She did not know that her husband, a man she had not yet met, a soldier who had survived a Soviet camp that had none of the rules Virginia had, would listen to her talk about peaches and syrup and shake his head in quiet disbelief. What she knew on that May morning, with the loudspeaker still echoing and the eggs getting cold on her plate, was that she was leaving this place carrying something heavier and more complicated than lice. She was carrying the knowledge of what her country had done, and the knowledge of how another country had chosen by contrast to behave. Both of those things would go home with her. One would haunt her for the rest of her life. The other would give her the language to explain the haunting to her children and her children's children in a Germany that was slowly, painfully learning to ask the questions it had avoided for too long. In Part 3, the ship carries her back. The coast of Germany appears. And the woman who steps off that vessel is not the same woman who gripped the rail in New York Harbor and smelled coffee and expected cruelty. What she finds in Hamburg will be the final test of everything she has understood, and some of it will break her heart in ways the camp never did. She came home with her beliefs in ruins and her body intact. The camp in Virginia had given her clean sheets, hot food, and a projector screen that showed her what her own government had built in the dark. Now, she had to take all of that back to Hamburg. Petitte, in Part 1. 48 German women arrived in New York Harbor expecting cruelty and found soap instead. In Part 2, a film in a darkened recreation hut showed them what cruelty actually looked like and who had built it. Anna Bauer filled a notebook with questions she could not answer out loud. Then the loudspeaker crackled. Germany surrendered. And the ship that would carry her home began to load. She thought she was prepared for what she would find. She was not even close. By May 1945, Hamburg had ceased to exist in any form Anna Bauer recognized. This was not metaphor. The firebombing campaign that began in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, had deployed more than 3,000 Allied aircraft over 8 days and killed between 37,000 and 43,000 people. In a single week, the resulting firestorm created winds of 240 kilometers per hour that sucked oxygen from basement shelters and turned entire districts into crematoriums. By the time Anna's ship reached Bremerhaven in late 1945, roughly 60% of Hamburg's residential buildings had been destroyed or damaged. The harbor she remembered cranes ferries. The smell of fish and diesel was a shoreline of rusted skeletons. No. The train north moved through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, if the moon had been built by people and then unmade by other people with great deliberation. Station roofs were gone. Platforms stood open to gray sky. Through the frost-clouded windows, Anna watched city after city present itself as a variation on the same image, chimneys standing alone where buildings had been like fingers pointing at nothing. Walls with empty window frames. Children picking through rubble with the focused, practiced efficiency of people who had been doing it long enough that it no longer felt extraordinary. She found her parents in a converted school on a hill above what had been their neighborhood. The flat was a hole. The school hallway smelled of cabbage soup, wet wool, and the specific density of too many people in a space not designed for habitation. Her mother's hair had gone completely white. Her father walked with a limp from shrapnel taken during a raid. Her younger brother was listed as missing in the East, a designation that, by late 1945, most families understood to mean something permanent. Her mother held her in the hallway for a long moment without speaking. Then, "You are alive. We thought you in enemy hands. We thought..." They sat on a hard bench with tin cups of thin soup. Her father asked if she had been beaten. Her mother asked if she had been shamed. Anna told them about the shaved head and watched their faces shift from fear to relief, and then as she continued to something more complicated. She told them about the mattress, the white soap, the mess hall, the canned peaches. The silence that followed was of a specific kind. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people processing an arithmetic that does not balance. "Better," her mother repeated. Her voice was careful, the way you are careful with something that might break. "While we hid in cellars on 800 calories a day, you had meat." Her father looked at the window. "We burned our furniture to stay warm, but at least we were not prisoners." Anna could not answer. Her throat was dry. The paradox she had been carrying since Virginia had just completed its circuit. In the camp, she had felt guilty for eating while her family starved. Now, she was home, and her family was making her feel guilty for having eaten. The same fact. Two directions of shame. A closed loop with no exit. She took work at a hospital wiping floors at first, then slowly returning to nursing as the Occupation Administration began organizing medical infrastructure. The hospital was cold. Supplies were sporadic. Patients came in with frostbite and malnutrition and injuries from accidents in the rubble that had not been properly treated for months because there had been nothing to treat them with. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, temperatures across northern Germany dropped to levels not recorded in decades. The Elbe froze. Coal rationing cut deliveries to levels that made it physiologically impossible to keep an unheated room warm enough for a sick person to survive in. Caloric rations in some zones fell below 1,000 calories per day. Anna worked double shifts. She came home to a cot in a room she shared with 2 other nurses and lay in the dark and thought about Virginia. She hated that she thought about it. She hated the specific way her mind would produce unbidden the smell of the mess hall or the texture of the wool blankets, as if her body were filing a complaint about the current conditions by referencing the comparison case. She also understood, in a way she had not fully understood while she was there, what the camp in Virginia had actually been. It had been a country that had not been bombed. That was the simplest explanation, and also the deepest one. America had entered the war with its infrastructure intact, its farms producing its factories converting to military output without first having to be rebuilt from rubble. It could afford the Geneva Convention, not because it was more virtuous than other nations. Anna had read enough history to know that virtue was not evenly distributed across any national character, but because it had the physical resources to comply. Compliance cost something real. America could pay it. Germany had spent its resources building systems designed not to comply with any convention that recognized the humanity of its targets. She thought about the film in the recreation hut, the bulldozer. She thought about it most nights. Not the image itself, which she could not look at directly, even in memory, but the administrative reality beneath it, the train schedules, the paperwork, the careful columns of numbers that the Red Cross representative had described. The Reich had not been chaotic. It had been organized. The camps were not the result of disorder. They were the result of a state deciding, systematically and in writing, that certain categories of human being did not qualify for the protections that made the Virginia camp possible. She married in 1948. His name was Werner. He had fought on the Eastern Front, been captured in 1944, and spent 14 months in a Soviet camp before repatriation. His stories were of a different register entirely. No Geneva Convention, no Red Cross trucks, no canned peaches, starvation as policy, beatings as routine. Of the more than 3 million German prisoners taken by the Soviet Union, estimates suggest that between 1 and 1.3 million never returned. Werner was one of the ones who came back, and the fact that he came back had left marks on him that Anna could see but not always reach. When she told him about Virginia, he listened, the way he listened to everything carefully from a certain distance, as if he were always standing just outside the room where the conversation was happening. When she described the mattress and the hot water, and the private from Iowa who taught her English words on scraps of paper, Werner shook his head slowly. "They shaved your head," he said. "But they also shared their bread," she answered. "Yes," he said. "That is the difference." Wow. He understood the difference. He had lived the alternative. She began to speak more fully about Virginia only when her children were old enough to ask the questions that the post-war silence had made it impossible to ask before. Her daughter sat at the kitchen table one evening, sometime in the mid-1960s, the smell of stew and coffee in the air, and said, "Mother, where were you when it happened? What did you see? What did you believe?" Anna told her everything. The lice, the chair, the nurse's hands on her skull, and the word sorry in slow German. The peaches, the film, the printed sheet with the number 6 million and the 40,000 sites, the notebook, the train back to Bremerhaven and the city that was not there anymore. Her father's face when she said the food had been better in the enemy's camp than at home. "They had every reason to hate us," she said. "We had followed a man who built those places you see in the photographs. Our submarines had killed their sailors. Our bombs had killed their allies. And the first English sentence I learned in that camp was 'Take there is plenty.'" Her daughter wrote a school paper about it. Anna read it and corrected 2 facts and let the rest stand. In the 1990s, a local historian came with a tape recorder. By then, Anna's hair was thin and white, and her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who has said the important things enough times that the saying of them no longer costs what it once cost. She kept a small wooden box in her wardrobe. Inside were 3 things: the English word list Jack Miller had written on scraps of paper, a canteen coupon worth 5 American cents, and the Red Cross booklet with the Geneva Convention text. She opened the box for the historian and held the word list under the light. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Cart, soap, bucket, sun, rain, peace. We went out into the world as Germans, she told the historian. We had been told we were a special people. We ended the war in a camp in Virginia, learning that the people we called barbaric had laws to protect even their enemies. We came as the certain ones. We left as students. A letter arrived years later with an American stamp. It was from Jack Miller's daughter writing after her father's death. He had kept a photograph of the camp laundry group in his papers. Next to it, a note in his handwriting. German girl Anna taught me that enemy also human. Anna wrote back by hand. She was in her 70s by then. Her handwriting was slow and deliberate. Your father's small kindness. She wrote the extra word, the simple respect did more to undo the teaching of my youth than any argument ever could. You cannot be told that the enemy is human. You have to be shown. He showed me. Every day without making a speech about it, without asking for credit, he showed me. She sealed the envelope and walked to the post box at the end of her street. The street was quiet and clean and lined with trees. Young people cycled past speaking German and English interchangeably. A woman pushed a pram. Someone's radio played American music from an open window without anyone thinking of enemy lines. Anna posted the letter and walked home in the afternoon light. In Part 4, the final chapter, we step back from Anna's story and look at the full scale of what the American POW system meant. 380,000 German prisoners. 500 camps, 1 document signed in Geneva in 1929, and a question that still has no easy answer when you hold power over people who cannot protect themselves. What does your choice in that moment say about who you actually are? The answer, it turns out, is everything. And a few people, in a few quiet places, proved that even in the middle of a war that killed 60 million human beings, the choice to follow rules could be made, and kept. That story, the full story, is in Part 4. 4 parts. 4 women in a troop ship. 1 nurse from Hamburg who arrived expecting cruelty and found soap. 1 private from Iowa who wrote English words on scraps of paper. 1 projector in a recreation hut that showed 48 German women what their government had built in the dark. And 1 question that has been running underneath all of it from the beginning: when you hold absolute power over people who cannot protect themselves, what does your choice in that moment say about who you actually are? We have spent 3 parts watching Anna Bauer move from a lice-infested transit camp in France to a mess hall in Virginia where the peaches came in syrup, and then back to a Hamburg that no longer existed. Now it is time for the final chapter. The one that answers the question. The one that most history books skip because it is not about tanks or generals or turning points on maps. It is about what happened after. To Anna, to Jack, to the 48, and to the idea that a piece of paper signed in Geneva in 1929 could hold even under the pressure of the most destructive war in human history. Anna Bauer lived until 2003. She was 82 years old when she died in a quiet street in Hamburg, in a city that had rebuilt itself so thoroughly that her grandchildren had to look at photographs to understand what it had looked like in the winter of 1945. She worked as a nurse for 31 years, retiring in 1976 from the same hospital system she had entered, as a floor scrubber in 1946. She married Werner in 1948. They had 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and 1 argument they never fully resolved about whether the Soviet camp or the American camp represented the more honest version of how nations behave when the cameras are not watching. Werner believed the Soviet camp was the honest version. Anna believed the Virginia camp was. Neither of them was entirely wrong. And she was not decorated. She received no official recognition for anything she experienced or witnessed or recorded in her notebooks. She was a prisoner of war who came home, found her city in ruins, and got to work. This was not unusual. Of the 48 women who stepped off that troop ship in March 1945, most returned to lives of reconstruction rather than commemoration. They rebuilt, remarried, raised children in the rubble, and then in the new flats that went up on top of the rubble. And they carried Virginia inside them, the way you carry a scar, not always visible, but always there when the light hits at the right angle. What Anna did, that most of the others did not, was keep writing. The notebooks continued after Virginia, after Hamburg, after Werner, after her children left home and the grandchildren started arriving and unified Germany became a different country from the one she had been born into. She wrote about the camp in the way that people write about experiences they have not finished processing, returning to the same moments, the same details, finding new things in them each time. The clippers, the word sorry, the peaches, the film, the printed sheet with the number 6 million. She returned to these things not because they were pleasant, but because they were where the important work was. Her daughter donated the notebooks to a regional archive in 2005, 2 years after Anna's death. They are there now. 22 notebooks, 40 years of returning to one experience that lasted 8 months and changed the direction of everything that came after. The archivist who cataloged them described them as among the most detailed first-hand accounts of the American POW system from the perspective of a German female prisoner. They have been cited in 3 academic papers and 1 documentary that aired on German public television in 2011. Anna would have found this mildly amusing and not particularly important. What she thought was important, she said. In the 1990s, interview with the local historian was not the notebooks themselves, but what they were evidence of. The capacity to change. To take an idea you have lived inside for 20 years, and when presented with sufficient contradictory evidence, begin the slow, painful work of revising it. Not abandoning it overnight. Not pretending you never held it, but revising it, piece by piece, the way you rebuild a city brick by brick in the cold with inadequate tools for as long as it takes. The letter from Jack Miller's daughter arrived in 1987. Anna was 66 years old. She read it at the kitchen table with Werner sitting across from her eating breakfast, and she did not say anything for a long time. The letter said that Jack had died the previous year in Iowa at 74. His daughter had found the photograph of the laundry group and the note, "German girl, Anna taught me that enemy also human," while going through his papers. She had spent several months tracking down an address. She wanted Anna to know that her father had talked about the camp, about the German women, about a specific woman named Anna who had learned English from scraps of paper for the rest of his life. Anna wrote back the same day. Werner read the letter before she sealed it. He did not say anything either for a while. Then he kept the photograph. "Yes," Anna said. "For 40 years, Werner said. "Yes." Werner looked out the window at the street where their grandchildren sometimes played. "That is something," he said. It was the closest he ever came to conceding her side of the argument about which camp represented the more honest version. Jack Miller had returned to Iowa after the war and farmed for 30 years. He had never written a memoir. He had never given an interview. He had taught one German prisoner English words on scraps of paper in a laundry room in Virginia in 1945. Kept a photograph of her, written a 7-word note, and gone home to plant corn. This is the most common shape that decency takes. Not dramatic, not recorded, not decorated, just a consistent choice made daily, to treat whoever is in front of you as a person. The Geneva Convention that the Red Cross representative held up in that recreation hut in April 1945 has been revised and expanded several times since then. The 1949 revision, passed in direct response to the documented abuses of the Second World War, on all sides extended protection to civilians in conflict zones, not just prisoners of war. It was signed by nearly every nation on Earth and has been cited in virtually every subsequent international tribunal dealing with war crimes. The document that protected Anna Bauer in Virginia, that entitled her to food, medical care, shelter, and pay for her labor, became the foundation of modern international humanitarian law. This is the direct line from a shed in New York Harbor to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. From a nurse saying, "I am sorry," when she nicked a scalp, to prosecutors presenting evidence of systematic violations of the same protections that made that apology possible. The convention works not because all nations follow it, but because enough nations follow it, enough of the time that its violation is recognizable as a violation. You can only call something a war crime if there is a law it breaks. The law Anna experienced in Virginia, imperfectly and in the middle of a war, is the law that makes the naming of crimes possible. By the end of the Second World War, the United States had held approximately 400,000 German prisoners of war in more than 500 camps across the continental United States. The mortality rate among German POWs held by American forces was less than 1%. In Soviet captivity, the estimate is between 15 and 30%, depending on the year and the region. The difference is not a matter of national virtue. It is a matter of resources, logistics, and the decision to be bound by a legal framework even when no one is watching. 3,700,000 German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces in the final weeks of the European War. The processing and repatriation of this number of people fed and housed and provided medical care in accordance with the convention represents the largest single compliance operation in the history of international law. It was imperfect. There were abuses. There were guards who were cruel and administrators who cut corners and camps where conditions fell below the standards required. The system was not a moral ideal. It was a system run by human beings under wartime pressure that nonetheless held its shape well enough to make Anna Bauer's experience in Virginia possible. She arrived expecting the worst and found something that did not fit into any category she had been given for thinking about enemies. That is the most destabilizing thing that can happen to a person whose identity is built on certainty about who the enemy is. Not violence, not cruelty, kindness, rules. A nurse who apologizes when she cuts too deep. Here is the detail that almost no one who tells this story includes. In 2009, a researcher at a German university studying the post-war correspondence of American veterans came across a box of letters in a private collection in Iowa. The letters were from a woman with a Hamburg return address written between 1987 and 1992. They were addressed to the daughter of a man named Jack Miller. The researcher recognized the name from a footnote in an academic paper about female German POWs. She requested permission to photograph the letters. The family agreed. The last letter in the sequence, dated March 1992, contains one paragraph that the researcher described as the most concise summary of the entire German post-war moral reckoning she had encountered in her research. Anna was 71 when she wrote it. Werner had died the previous winter. She was writing, she said, because she wanted to tell someone who would understand what she meant. The paragraph reads in translation. For a long time, I thought the lesson of Virginia was about America. About what America was that we were not. But I think now the lesson is simpler than that. The lesson is about rules. A rule that says a prisoner is a human being is not a rule about the prisoner. It is a rule about the person holding the power. When you follow it, you are telling yourself something true about what you are. When you break it, you are telling yourself something that will take generations to unlearn. She was right. The unlearning has taken generations. It is not finished. The entire arc of this story, from the Cold Harbor in March 1945 to the kitchen table in Hamburg in 1992, can be reduced to a single contrast. One state told its people that certain categories of human being did not qualify for protection. Another state signed a piece of paper saying that every prisoner, regardless of what they had done or who they served, qualified for food, shelter, medical care, and basic dignity. The first state fell in 12 years and left behind a rubble field that took decades to clear. The second state, imperfect and inconsistent and capable of its own cruelties in other contexts, held to the paper well enough that 48 German women went home carrying evidence of it in their bodies well-fed, lice-free changed. Anna Bauer was not a symbol. She was a person who survived a war, found her city gone, rebuilt, her life in the ruins, kept writing in notebooks for 40 years, and mailed a letter to Iowa in 1987 that a researcher found in 2009. Her story did not change the course of the war. It did not appear in the newspapers. It was not the subject of a film until a documentary crew spent 3 days in Hamburg in 2011 filming an 80-year-old woman's handwriting through archival glass. But it answers the question we started with. When you hold power over people who cannot protect themselves, what does your choice say about who you are? And it says everything. It says it in the moment, and it says it for generations afterward. It is said in soap and hot water, and the word sorry in slow German. It is said in a 7-word note kept in a box in Iowa for 40 years. It is said in 22 notebooks donated to a regional archive by a woman's daughter because the woman who filled them believed that what happened in a camp in Virginia in 1945 was worth remembering long after the people who lived it were gone. If you know a story like this one, a small, unrecorded moment of decency in the middle of catastrophe, leave it in the comments. These stories exist in family papers and old shoeboxes and regional archives all over the world. They deserve to be found. Subscribe, and we will keep looking for them. Because the ones history almost forgot are very often the ones that matter most. The Reich built a 1,000-year empire and lasted 12 years. A private from Iowa wrote words on scraps of paper and changed one woman's mind about what the enemy was. 50 years later, she was still writing about it. That is the only arithmetic that matters.